The rain hadn't stopped over Chicago's South Side for 3 days, when a woman named Maeve Donnelly knelt on the wet floor of a velvet-lit lounge and pulled her 2 little girls behind her, while a woman in a $6,000 dress screamed that they smelled like the gutter they came from. Maeve was 27, a widow with calloused hands and a nursing degree she'd never finished, working the night shift because no one would watch her twins after dark, and she didn't scream back. She didn't beg. She just lifted her chin and said the only thing that mattered. "You can say whatever you want to me, but they're 4 years old." What she couldn't see, what nobody in that crowded room could see, was the man standing in the shadows of the mezzanine above them, a man the city whispered about and never named out loud, a man at 37 who owned the building, owned the woman in the dress, owned half the secrets buried in this city. He should have turned and walked away. Men like him didn't waste a second glance on a cleaning woman and her kids. But he didn't walk away. He went very, very still, his glass halfway to his lips, his eyes locked on the smaller twin, clutching a frayed red string bracelet, and something crossed his face that none of his men had seen in years, something that looked almost like a ghost. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know what the next 90 seconds were about to drag up out of a past he'd spent his whole life burying. All he knew was that he couldn't make himself look away. If a story about second chances and the people we overlook is the kind of thing that moves you, do me a quick favor. Tap that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Now, let's go back to that lounge, to the rain, and to the moment everything changed. The silence that fell over the room right after that was the kind of silence people choose when everyone wants to become invisible. The bartenders suddenly found reasons to polish glasses. A pair of investors near the glass window turned their backs and lowered their voices. No one wanted to be remembered as a witness. Sloane Whitlock still hadn't let it go. She smoothed the strap of her dress where the wine had soaked darkly into the silk, then looked down at Maeve with a disgust she had clearly practiced until it became effortless. She asked if Maeve had any idea how much this thing was worth, if she understood what a place like this even was. It wasn't a daycare for whatever she dragged in from the street. Maeve stayed exactly as she was, one arm still curved behind her 2 children. She answered softly that she would pay for the cleaning, that it was only an accident. And Sloane let out a short, cold laugh, asking what she was going to pay with. Tips, probably. Then she turned away, sweeping her eyes around the room until she found the person she needed and called his name. Arthur. Arthur. Come here. Arthur Price had managed the Gilded Crow for 9 years, and in those 9 years, he had learned exactly how much firmness a man in his position was allowed to have. He crossed the floor with both hands clasped together, his face already arranged into an apology before he even arrived. He said, "Miss Whitlock, I am terribly sorry. This won't." But Sloane cut him off, saying this woman had brought children into her fiancé's club. They had run around loose, they had ruined a dress, and he had allowed it to happen. She let the accusation hang in the air for a beat, then said she wanted Maeve gone, tonight, and she didn't want to see her face there ever again. Arthur's eyes flicked toward Maeve, only for a second, but it was long enough for her to read everything in them. The apology, the helplessness, and the calculation of a man who had bills of his own, people of his own to protect, a man weighing one quiet employee against a name that could end his career with a single phone call. He said softly, "Maeve, maybe you should take the children home. We'll talk tomorrow." But that wasn't mercy, and both of them knew it. Maeve stood up. She didn't argue. Arguing was a luxury reserved for people who still had somewhere else to fall. She picked up the coats, took each child by the hand, and turned toward the staff door, the door that opened into the alley instead of the glittering grand lobby. What she would never know was how close the man on the mezzanine had come to speaking. Through the entire exchange, he hadn't moved. He had watched Sloane put her cruelty on display, watched Arthur bow under it, watched the small woman with the most exhausted eyes refuse to bend along with him, and he realized something that unsettled him more than everything else. The younger child hadn't cried. Through all of it, the little girl had only pressed herself against her mother's leg and held that frayed red bracelet to her chest, as if it were the only certain thing left in the world. He set his glass down on the railing without a sound. Below, Sloane was already laughing with someone else. The matter was finished, forgotten, thrown beneath her notice. She had no idea she was being watched by the one person in that building whose opinion could crush her. She had no idea that the man who owned this club, who also owned the debt note on her father's favorite restaurant along with 3 judges besides, had just placed her face into that cold, careful place where he kept the names of people who had disappointed him. He waited until the staff door closed behind the woman and the 2 children. Only then did he find Finn at the foot of the stairs and say 4 words, quietly enough that no one else could hear. Find out who she is. The apartment sat about 4 blocks from a train line that ran all night, and Maeve had learned to sleep through the sound of the trains the way people learn to sleep through almost anything when they're exhausted enough. 2 rooms, an old radiator that kept clanking, and a window looking out at a brick wall so close she could have reached out and touched it. She took off the children's wet shoes, changed them into dry socks, warmed a can of soup on the stove while they ate, then counted the night's tips on the tabletop. $41 and a few cents. She folded it and slipped it into the coffee tin where she kept the rent money, a tin so light she didn't need to open it to know exactly how light it was. The notice had come on Tuesday, the final notice, the kind with a proper date printed on it. She had read it twice, then tucked it beneath the stack of mail where she wouldn't have to look at it anymore. "Mommy," Haven took the big spoon, Willa said, not exactly tattling, only reporting. "I gave it back," Haven answered at once, which meant she hadn't given it back, and Maeve almost smiled. They were only 4 years old, and already completely themselves. Haven met the world with her chin lifted first, loud and solid, the kind of child who would walk up to a stranger in a laundromat and tell them her whole life story, while Willa watched from behind her sister's back. Quieter, slower to trust, her thumb always finding the frayed red bracelet on her wrist whenever a room became too large or too loud. Sean had made that bracelet. He had made one for each of them, sitting right at this table 3 years earlier, when their tiny wrists were just beginning to grow, with a length of red embroidery thread and the kind of patience that made Maeve love him for it. He wasn't a man of grand gestures. He was steady, a mechanic with grease beneath his fingernails and a gentle voice, the kind of goodness that didn't need to announce itself. He had stepped into their lives when the little girls had only just begun to toddle, and he had loved them as if they had always been his. He had been gone for 2 years now, a weak heart no one had known about, one morning when he simply didn't wake up anymore. Sometimes Maeve still reached for him in that half-second before she remembered. Haven's bracelet had been lost after only a few months, slipping from her wrist in a park and never found again. But Willa had never once taken hers off. The child slept with it on her hand. She held it the way other children held blankets, and Maeve had stopped trying to wash it because of the panic that overtook Willa whenever it left her wrist. She ran about 2 inches of warm water into the tub and knelt beside it while the 2 girls splashed, telling the story she always told. The one about the brave rabbit who wasn't afraid of the dark. Haven helped recite half the words because she knew them by heart, while Willa only listened, her small face solemn in the rising steam. Later, after both children had been tucked into the bed, all 3 of them shared. In the darkness with the sound of the train passing by, Willa's voice rose, small and sudden. "Mommy, are we safe?" Maeve went still. It was the question Willa had started asking after Sean died. Not every night, but often enough that Maeve felt it touch some deep place inside her each time, as if the child had understood, before she had enough words to say it, that the floor beneath their lives was thinner than it looked. "Yes, sweetheart," Maeve whispered, brushing the hair back from the little girl's forehead. "We're safe. Mommy's right here." Willa considered that with the solemnity only a 4-year-old could bring to something that mattered, then pressed the bracelet to her cheek and closed her eyes, choosing, for this night, to believe her mother. And Maeve lay awake long after her children's breathing had slowed into an even rhythm, thinking about Arthur's face, thinking about the date printed on the notice beneath the mail, thinking about what she would do tomorrow, and the day after that, without ever finding the bottom of it. She didn't think about the bar, or the woman in the silk dress, or the truth that somewhere across the city, a man she had never met was, in that very moment, reading her name on a sheet of paper for the first time. The house in Lake Forest sat behind a wall, a gate, and a 1/4 mile of trees that kept the road from seeing it. From the outside, it was nothing at all, only the stillness of old money, gray stone, the kind of mansion that didn't need to announce what it was. Inside, it was colder than the November air beyond its walls, and not because of the heating system. Killer and Voss drank black coffee at 5 o'clock in the morning in a study lined with books he had never read, while the city he ruled slept off whatever it had done the night before. He had built something here, from a boy who had grown up flinching at the sound of his own father's footsteps. He had built an empire with 100 doors and not a single window. Gambling fed the lounges washed the money, and the money bought the kind of silence other men only dared to dream of. People feared him because fear was useful, and because somewhere along the way, he had stopped being able to tell the difference between control and survival. He had no weaknesses. He had made certain of that. A man with nothing left to lose couldn't be threatened, couldn't be bought, couldn't be shaken. It had cost him every soft thing he had ever owned, and for most of his life he had considered that a fair trade. Finn Gallagher came in without knocking, because Finn was the only man allowed to do that. He set a thin file on the desk and said, "The woman at the Crow. Just like you asked." Kill didn't open it right away. He had been awake all night, and he was irritated with himself over the reason. It was the child, the smaller one, the one with the bracelet. Something in her face had caught on a place inside him he always kept sealed shut, and he couldn't explain why. Not being able to explain something was the closest thing to fear he still allowed himself to feel. "You watched the whole thing," Finn said, not as a question. He had been standing at the foot of the stairs. "You usually don't care when Sloane makes a scene." Kill answered, "I don't care now." Finn said nothing, and that silence was a comment all its own. He had worked for Kill for 11 years. He was the only living man who knew where Kill's compassion had been buried, mostly because he had watched it die. "There's trouble coming with Keene," Finn went on, changing the subject the way a man steps around broken glass. "He's buying up debt on the west side, quietly. 3 of our collectors were approached by him last week. He's testing the fence, looking for a gap," Kill said. "There isn't one," Finn answered. "There's always one. He just hasn't found it yet." Kill finally drew the file toward him and said, "Then we make sure he doesn't find it." The night before, he had ordered a man named Petrov taken down to the basement of one of the warehouses, a collector who had been skimming for months while thinking no one had noticed. Kill had handled it himself, the way he handled every serious matter, with a calm that frightened men more than rage ever could. There had been no children anywhere near it. He had rules about that, though no one had ever asked him why. He had let the man live, which, in his world, counted as restraint. Then he had let the story spread, because one story could do the work of 10 enforcers. That was who he was. That was who he had been forced to become. He opened the file. A name at the top. A photograph clipped to the corner. The woman from the lounge, younger in the picture, taken from some old identification card. He read the first line, then the second, and the cold, controlled thing that ruled an entire city suddenly went very still, exactly as it had gone still on the mezzanine, for reasons he still couldn't name. The file was thin because there wasn't much in it. People like Maeve Donnelly didn't leave long trails behind. They only left the kind of paperwork that proved one thing: how hard they had struggled not to go under. A lease agreement, a string of waitressing jobs, an application withdrawing from a nursing program 4 years earlier. No criminal record, no money, no one who would come looking if she disappeared. Widow, the file said. Husband named Sean Donnelly, deceased. Something with the heart. 2 years earlier. A mechanic. Almost nothing noteworthy in his background. A man who had lived and died without troubling anyone. 2 daughters, twins, 4 years old. Kill read that line and felt something shift, vague and wrong, like a draft slipping through the crack of a door he had believed was sealed shut. 4 years old. He sat with that number. He told himself it meant nothing. This city was full of widows and full of twins. And a man who started seeing ghosts in a file was a man who had lost his clarity. But the unease wouldn't settle. It circled the edge of his attention all morning, through 2 phone calls and a meeting where he barely heard a word anyone said, and he kept returning to the photograph clipped in the corner, not to the woman's face anymore, but to the memory it had just shaken loose. 5 years earlier, he had been a different kind of dangerous, hungrier, not yet crowned, not yet untouchable, still a man who sometimes moved through the world as if he belonged to it. There had been a stretch of that winter, before the war that made his name, before he buried whatever was left of the man he used to be, when he had still been someone a stranger might have sat laughing with in a bar. There had been a woman. He couldn't, if he was honest, remember her face. In the years that followed, he had been very careful to remember as little as possible about the man he had once been, because being the thing he had become was easier if the time before it stayed blurred. A girl, dark eyes, a laugh that had cut through the noise of a bad night and made it bearable for a while. He had given her a name that hadn't even been his real one. He had left before morning, the way he always left, and he had never thought about it again, because thinking about it required being a man who was still capable of thinking. He killed the thought hard. That was the trick with ghosts. You fed them by looking at them. Boss. Finn was standing in the doorway again. You all right? Fine, Kill answered, closing the file. His voice gave nothing away, because his voice had never given anything away. The woman. She's out of the Crow, isn't she? Whitlock took care of it. Arthur let her go this morning. Kill looked at the gray window for a while, then said, in the flat voice of a man closing a matter instead of opening it, find out where she lives. That's all. Finn lingered for a beat, as if he meant to say something, then chose not to and walked out. Left alone, Kill pulled open a drawer, dropped the file inside, and pushed it shut. Closed, stored, done. He didn't allow himself to wonder why his hand had paused, just for 1 second, at the edge of the desk. He was very good at not wondering. He had spent a lifetime practicing it, but the draft was in the room now, and there were doors that, once they had let in even a little cold, would never close all the way again. Sloane Whitlock knew about the file before Kill realized she knew, because that was how she had survived in the world that had chosen her as a pawn. She listened. She noticed. She paid the right people to notice for her. And when one of Kill's drivers casually mentioned that Finn had someone verify the address of a waitress from the Crow, what rose inside her wasn't curiosity, but an old fear, familiar enough to feel almost like a friend. She sat in the penthouse, overlooking the lake, turning her engagement ring around her finger the way she always did when she didn't want anyone to see her hand trembling. And she thought about the woman kneeling on the floor of the club that night, the woman she had torn apart with words and gained nothing from except the emptiness that came afterward. She wondered why, out of all the invisible people who had ever passed through Kill's life, he had sent someone to investigate that one. She didn't love Killeran Voss. She was honest enough with herself to admit that in the deepest hours of the night. But she had wagered her entire life on him, and a wager needed to be protected just like love did, sometimes even more fiercely. In the drawer of her vanity, beneath the lining, there was an envelope she hadn't shown anyone, letterhead from a clinic on North Michigan Avenue, words she had read enough times to know by heart even though she wanted only to forget them. Very low fertility, limited options, advice to consider them soon. She had sat in the clinic parking lot for 40 minutes after receiving that paper, not crying, only staring at the steering wheel, because all her life she had been taught that the value of a woman like her lay in what she could bring to an alliance, and now her body might not be able to bring the one thing everyone silently expected. At that very moment, a woman with 2 children appeared at the edge of her fiancé's attention. And fear didn't need logic to take root. It only needed an existing wound. Her father, Desmond Whitlock, called that afternoon, his voice still carrying the same velvety calm with which he had closed deals other men had to bleed for. He didn't ask if she was all right. He asked whether the wedding date had been settled. He reminded her that the Whitlock family had spent 3 generations washing its name clean, and that this marriage was the bridge, the place where the family's clean money shook hands with a kind of power clean money could never buy on its own. He said, "You have to understand, Sloane. This isn't about feelings. This is architecture, and you're the keystone." He used that exact word, keystone, as though her only worth was keeping someone else's roof from collapsing. She hung up and stood for a long time beside the glass, and she hated what she was about to do, even as she already knew she would do it, because when a woman has been taught that she's only worth what can replace her, the first threat she sees is always another woman, not the system that has trapped them both. She thought of the waitress's face, of the 2 children, of the red bracelet the smaller child clutched so tightly. And instead of seeing a human being there, she saw only what she couldn't have, and a danger that had to be smothered before it had time to grow. She reached for the phone, called Arthur Price, and in the voice that had recovered all its familiar sharpness, she began arranging things to make certain that the woman named Maeve Donnelly would never set foot in any place bearing the Voss name again, never knowing that every move she made to defend herself was pushing the very person she feared closer to the truth that could burn everything to the ground. Sloane's call did exactly what it had been made to do. The next morning, Arthur Price asked Maeve to meet him at the club before opening, and she knew before he managed to say it, read it in the way he couldn't look her straight in the eye. He told her it wasn't her fault. He told her he had tried, but there were pressures he couldn't stand against. Her shifts had been cut. Not only that night's shift, but all of them, And the other places in the city where she still picked up daytime cleaning work also began sending messages, one after another, saying they no longer needed anyone. Polite, vague, all at once, in the way that could only come from one single hand arranging things from behind. Arthur pressed 2 weeks of wages into her hand, plus a little extra from his own pocket, and she took it because refusing was another luxury she couldn't afford. She thanked him, sincerely, because she knew he was only a small gear like her inside a machine that crushed them both. When she got back to the apartment, she spread everything across the table: the coffee tin, the final notice with its date creeping steadily closer, the money Arthur had given her, and she did the calculation she had done 100 times before. The answer still didn't change. It wasn't enough. Even if she cut everything down to the bone, it still wouldn't be enough to keep these 2 rooms through the end of the month. For the first time in a very long while, she let herself sit still on the edge of the bed and not know how to take the next step. The little girls were napping. Willa still held the bracelet in her sleep, and Maeve looked at them and swallowed down the thing rising in her throat because she didn't allow herself to break apart in front of her children. Late in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door, not the knock of anyone she knew. When she opened it, the hallway was empty. At her feet lay a thick envelope, with no sender's name, not a single written word. She picked it up and knew what it was at once from its weight and thickness. She closed the door, sat down, opened it, and inside was cash. More money than she had ever held at one time in her life. Enough to pay off the rent debt, enough to breathe for a few months, enough for the date on the notice to stop being a blade. She sat for a long time with the stack of money in her lap, and what chilled her wasn't the amount, but the silence around it. Honest money came with a name, a word, a hand to shake. Money that arrived this quietly was always money with an owner, and a nameless gift was a gift that tied a person to something they weren't yet allowed to understand. She had lived long enough at the bottom of this city to know that no one gave poor people anything for free, especially not this much. She thought about the bar, about the woman in the silk dress, about the feeling of being watched that she couldn't explain that night, and an uneasy, shapeless thought began to form before she hurriedly pushed it away. She picked up the envelope, set it down, then picked it up again. Her daughters were sleeping. The notice was still lying there, and it would have been so easy, so terribly human, to simply keep it and close her eyes to the question of where it had come from. But she thought about having to explain one day to Haven and Willa that there are things you accept and then owe for, and there are debts more expensive than the very disaster they saved you from. And she knew, with the same stubbornness that had kept her standing upright for 4 years while the world only wanted her to bend, that she would have to find out who had left it there and return it directly into that person's hands, even if returning it might mean pushing away the only thing keeping this roof from collapsing over her children's heads. She didn't have to go looking for him, because 2 days later he came looking for her, and Maeve knew it was him the moment she opened the door, even though she had never clearly seen his face. Some people carried the whole room with them when they entered a place, and the man standing in the shabby hallway of her building, in a coat worth a full year's rent on this apartment, made that hallway seem smaller and more temporary than it already was. He didn't give his name. He only said he was the owner of the Gilded Crow, and that he had come to apologize for what had happened. Maeve stood across the doorway, not inviting him in, one hand still on the edge of the door, and she said she didn't need his apology. She needed her shifts, and she guessed he hadn't brought those with him. He tilted his head slightly, a very small gesture, as if that answer had shown him something unexpected. Most people, when standing in front of him, did one of 2 things. They either shrank back or started begging. This woman did neither. She looked straight at him with eyes that were tired but didn't lower, and he realized he was noticing that in the way a man who hadn't encountered anything new in too long notices something new. She stepped back inside 1 pace, picked up the envelope from the shelf, then turned and held it out to him. "Your money," she said. "I'm giving it back." He didn't take it. He only looked at it, then looked at her. He asked how she knew it was his. She answered that she hadn't known for certain until this second. One corner of his mouth lifted faintly, not quite a smile. "Keep it," he said. "Consider it a correction toward fairness. You lost your job over something that wasn't your fault." Maeve didn't lower her hand. She said, "Losing my job is my problem to solve, not yours to buy back. And if I keep this, I'll owe you something I don't even know the shape of yet, and I don't feed my children with debts like that." For a moment, they both stood there in a silence, stretched tight as wire. He looked into the room behind her, at the coffee tin on the table, at the paper tucked beneath the stack of mail that he understood all too well was a certain kind of paper, at a mattress laid on the floor where the two children were sleeping, and he saw with cruel clarity that this money could change her entire life, that she knew it, and that she was still holding it out to return it. He wasn't used to that. In his world, everything had a price, and everyone was waiting for him to ask how much they cost. This woman had no price for him to ask about, or if she did, it wasn't something he could buy with an envelope. At last he took the envelope, slowly, as if even he didn't quite understand why he was yielding, and he said, "All right." Then he stood there for one beat longer than necessary, and just then a soft sound came from inside the room. One of the children turned in her sleep, and he saw Maeve's eyes immediately shift that way, her whole body tightening with caution, ready to stand between him and her daughters with her own body again if she had to. And he understood, with a strange feeling he couldn't name, that this was a woman whose entire life turned around one single task, keeping those two small lives safe, and that no amount of money, no threat, could make her step back from that place. "I didn't come here to hurt anyone," he said. And strangely, he found himself wanting her to believe it, a desire he hadn't planned for and wasn't allowed to have. Maeve looked at him for a long time, then answered, "People who don't come to hurt anyone usually don't need to say that." And she closed the door, gently, without slamming it, leaving him standing alone in the shabby hallway, with an envelope of money he didn't want to take back, and a feeling in his chest he had thought he'd buried years ago. That should have been the end of it, a door closing and a man returning to his empire, but he didn't leave. He stood in that hallway longer than he had meant to, and just as he turned to go, the door behind him opened again. It wasn't Maeve. It was much lower, level with his hip. It was the smaller of the two girls, the one with the bracelet. She must have woken up and slipped out while her mother was cleaning up in the other room, and now she stood there in the narrow opening of the half-open door, looking up at him with solemn dark eyes that held none of the fear a child should have felt when standing before someone like him. He stayed still, not daring to move, the way a person stays still before a small, wild creature that might flee at any moment. But the little girl didn't run. She tipped her face up and studied him from his shoes to his face with that complete concentration only children possess. Then she lifted her tiny wrist, turned it outward so he could see the frayed red thread bracelet, as if showing him a treasure. And in the small, clear voice of a 4-year-old child, she asked him if he was safe. Those 3 words went through him in a way no bullet, no threat, no enemy in more than 10 years had ever managed to do, because no one in his entire life had ever asked him that. People asked if he was powerful, if he was dangerous, if he kept his word. They asked what he was going to do to them. No one, not once, had ever stood before him and wanted to know whether being near him meant being safe, as if that were the most precious thing one human being could offer another. And he suddenly realized, with something tightening inside his chest, that he himself had never been safe. Not for a single day. Not when he was a boy flinching at the sound of his father's footsteps, and not now, standing at the top of an empire built from other people's fear. The little girl still held out her wrist, patiently waiting for an answer with absolute trust that there would be one. And he, the man the whole city didn't dare speak of aloud, stood there, not knowing what to say. He looked at the red bracelet, at the tiny fingers loosely curled around it, and something he had believed long dead stirred faintly in a very deep place, painful in the way a numbed limb begins to feel again. He crouched down slowly, not exactly kneeling, only no longer towering above her, and in a voice rougher than he wanted it to be, he said yes. Then he stopped, because he had never said this to anyone before, and wasn't sure he had the right to say it. "Yes, I'm safe." The little girl considered that with absolute seriousness, then gave one firm nod, as if she had just recorded an important truth somewhere inside herself. And just then Maeve appeared in the doorway, her face going white when she saw her daughter standing only a handspan away from that man. She called softly to Willa, then reached out and pulled the child into her arms, holding her tightly, her eyes never leaving him. But he wasn't looking at Maeve. He was still looking at the child. And in the moment before the door closed for the second time, Maeve caught something on the face of the most powerful man she had ever met. Something she couldn't fit into everything she thought she knew about him. Something that looked almost like a wound. And it unsettled her for the rest of that night, more than any threat he could have brought with him. Rory Keane had spent 3 years looking for a crack in Killer and Voss, and until recently he had still believed no such crack existed, because that was exactly what made Voss more dangerous than every other boss in the city. He didn't gamble too recklessly, didn't use drugs, didn't have a woman who could be threatened, didn't have a single person in the world who, if placed on the scale, would make his hand hesitate. A man like that couldn't be defeated with ordinary blows. He could only be surrounded and worn down, and Keene had patiently done exactly that, buying up debt on the west side, approaching Voss's collectors, probing every foot of the fence to find where the wood had rotted. But this week, one of his watchers brought back a small piece of news that seemed almost worthless, that Voss himself had driven to a rundown apartment building on the south side and stood in a ruined hallway for nearly 15 minutes to speak with a waitress who had just been fired. And Keene, sitting in the dim office behind a liquor store he used as a front, fell silent for a very long time after hearing it, because he had been in this business long enough to understand that a man with no weaknesses didn't suddenly drive halfway across the city to stand in a decaying hallway because of a cleaning woman. Men like Voss didn't do anything without a reason, and the only reason a man like that usually broke his own habits was the most dangerous reason of all, something he cared about. He didn't know who the woman was. He didn't know about the file. He certainly didn't know about the 2 children, or about anything deeper than that. And he didn't need to know. He only needed to know one thing, that after 3 years of searching, for the first time there was something in this world. Killeran Voss was looking at the way a man looks at something he's afraid to lose. And in their world, something your enemy cares about is never merely a person. It's a door, a point of leverage, a thread that, if pulled hard enough, can make the whole suit of armor come apart. Keene poured himself a drink, not to celebrate, but to think. And he considered all the ways a piece of information like this could be used. Not in haste, not right now, but slowly, at the right moment, when it would hurt the most, because he knew the instant he moved too early would be the instant he revealed that he had found the gap, and a revealed gap would be sealed at once by Voss with all the ruthlessness he was famous for. He called 2 men, the kind who worked cleanly and knew how to become invisible, and he gave them a simple order. Watch that woman. Learn where she goes every day. Learn what she fears. Learn what she loves. Don't touch her. Don't let her know. Just bring me a complete picture of who she is to Voss. His men nodded, then dissolved into the city's rainy darkness. What neither he nor the men he had just sent could foresee was that what they were following wasn't a hidden affair or an ordinary weakness, but a truth larger and more explosive than anything they imagined. And by turning his eyes toward Maeve Donnelly, Rory Keene had unknowingly lit the fuse on a chain of events that would pull 2 innocent children into the orbit of a war they didn't even know existed, turning a woman who only wanted to keep a roof over her head into the center of a danger even greater than the poverty she was fighting. A danger whose cost, this time, wouldn't be measured in rent money, but in human lives. Maeve noticed the car on Thursday afternoon, while she was walking to pick up the girls from an older neighbor named Mrs. Kowalski, who still watched them for a few hours in the afternoons, so Maeve could go around dropping off job applications. It was a dark sedan moving just a little slower than the rest of traffic, keeping the kind of distance that the survival instinct of a woman used to danger recognized at once as wrong. It had been there when she left the apartment, and now it was still there when she turned onto the second street, and the cold that ran down her spine had nothing to do with the rain. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury when 2 children were waiting. She only slowed her steps, changed direction, lifted Willa onto her hip, and tightened her hold on Haven's hand, calculating the shortest way back toward people and noise. But the sedan changed direction too, and this time it sped up a little, drawing close to the curb ahead of her. One door began to open, and for one moment her heart seemed to stop, because she knew, with a certainty as cold as ice, that she wouldn't be able to run fast enough with 2 small children in her arms. Then everything happened very quickly. A second car, larger and darker, shot out from the cross street and cut off the sedan with a sharp turn, so decisive that the scream of the tires tore through the afternoon. 2 men got out of the larger car, fast and silent, and with a calm more frightening than shouting, they moved toward the sedan. Maeve didn't see what happened after that, because a 3rd man had stepped up beside her. He didn't touch her. He only placed his body between her and the street and said in a low, steady voice, "Keep walking, ma'am. Right now. That way. Don't look back." And there was something in the way he said it that made her believe him. She turned, covered the children's eyes with her shoulder, and walked quickly, not looking back, letting the rain and those figures fall away behind them. So Willa saw nothing but the edge of her mother's coat, and Haven saw nothing but the back of the stranger clearing the way for them. Only when they were back inside the apartment, when she had locked the door, soothed the girls with the last cookies in the box, and turned on the television so its noise could cover the pounding of her own heart, did Maeve allow her hands to shake. And just then, her phone vibrated with an unknown number. She answered, and the voice on the other end was the same voice she had heard only once before at her own doorway. He asked if she and the children were all right, not in the voice of a man who had happened to hear about it, but in the voice of a man who had known everything the moment it happened. In that instant, all the scattered pieces suddenly locked together so clearly that she went cold. The nameless envelope of money, the feeling of being watched, the men appearing out of nowhere at exactly the right moment. In a quiet, flat voice, she asked, "You had people following me." He was silent for a beat long enough that the answer became clear before he even spoke. "I had people watching over you," he said. "There's a difference." Maeve closed her eyes and leaned back against the door. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or terrified, because the naked truth was that the man who had just saved her and her daughters from a strange car was a crime boss, and the shadow that had quietly kept her safe was also the same shadow whose world had drawn that danger to her door in the first place. And she heard herself ask through the phone, in the voice of a mother, not the voice of someone who had just been granted a favor. "Why? Why are you doing all this for us?" On the other end of the line, the man the whole city didn't dare speak of aloud stayed silent for a long time. So long she thought he had hung up, because he didn't have an answer either, or he had an answer he wasn't yet brave enough to look at directly. The answer waiting just beyond a door they were both about to be forced to open. He came the next evening, and this time Maeve let him in, not because she had stopped being cautious, but because there were questions that couldn't be asked through a door, left only slightly open. The two little girls were asleep in the other room, and she stood across from him in the cramped kitchen under the yellowing light, asking him directly why he had people watching over her before there had been any danger at all. Why would a boss like him pay attention to a cleaning woman? And he, a man who had never had to explain himself to anyone, stood there with the answer caught in his throat. Then he asked her a question that seemed to have nothing to do with it. "What month were your daughters born?" Maeve went still, not understanding, but she answered anyway, and when she said that month aloud, she saw his face change in a way she had never seen before. His stone calm cracked, and he asked again, so softly it was almost not a sound, who their father was. She answered, "My husband, Sean. He died 2 years ago." But something in the way she hesitated for half a second before that name spoke aloud the thing she had never said to anyone, and he caught that half second the way an animal catches a scent. "Sean Donnelly married you after the girls were already born, didn't he?" he said. He wasn't. And Maeve felt the whole room tilt, because for 4 years she had kept this hidden the way a person keeps a wound beneath clothing, that Sean had been the kind man who stepped into her life when she was pregnant and alone with nowhere to hold on, who married her, who loved the 2 girls as if they were his own blood, and who made each of them a red thread bracelet. But he wasn't the man who had created them. She stepped back, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, and asked him in a trembling voice why he cared, who he was to ask her these things. And when he lifted his eyes to hers, what she saw in them was something she had never seen before. Not power, not coldness, but the naked terror of a man standing at the edge of an abyss that had just opened under his feet. And he said, 5 years ago, a bar near the docks, a winter night, he had given her a name that wasn't his real one. Maeve heard those words, and the blood drained from her face, because she was the only person in the world who knew the rest of that story. She had been 22 years old, a nursing student working night shifts, and the unexpectedly kind man in the middle of a terrible night had disappeared before morning, leaving behind a false name and, a few weeks later, 2 lines on a test. "I tried to find you," she said, and her voice broke on the words. She had tried for months. She followed that false name until it led her to a man who didn't exist, then to people who told her that if she was smart, she would stop asking. Once, someone cornered her outside the room where she was staying and told her plainly that the man she was looking for didn't want to be found, and that forgetting him would be better for her health. She had been 22 years old, pregnant, with no money and no family, and she had done the only thing a person in that position could do. She stopped looking. She gave birth. She built a life from nothing, and when Sean appeared, She had allowed herself to believe that the past had died and been buried. He stood there listening, and every word from her was a knife, because he realized that his own people, the very machine he had built to protect himself, had stopped a pregnant woman at the door and driven her away, had cut the only thread that could have led him to his children. And he had lived for 4 years only a few miles from them without knowing. He looked toward the door of the inner room where the 2 children were sleeping, the smaller one with the dark eyes that had frozen him in place from the night at the bar, and the truth he had pushed aside like a ghost in a file now stood before him, towering, undeniable, impossible to shut back into any drawer. Willa and Haven were his daughters, and the only person in the world who had ever tried to tell him was standing in front of him, trembling, having just spoken the secret that had defined her entire life, in a cramped kitchen where there no longer seemed to be enough air for both of them to breathe. He drove back to Lake Forest in the night, with almost no memory of the roads he had taken, his hands resting on the steering wheel by habit, while his mind remained behind in that cramped kitchen. For the first time in many years, Killer and Voss didn't feel in control of anything. He had built an entire life on one single foundation, that a man with nothing to lose couldn't be hurt. He had burned away every bond, pushed away every person who might become leverage against him, turned loneliness into armor and called it strength. And in one evening, all of that construction had collapsed, because out there, in a shabby apartment on the south side, there were 2 small lives carrying his blood, and their existence had just turned him from a fortress without doors into a man with exactly 2 places in the world that, if touched, would bring him to his knees. He sat in his dark study with the lights off, the bottle of liquor unopened, and let himself think the thing he had trained himself his entire life never to think. He thought about a 4-year-old child looking up at him and asking if he was safe. And now he understood a truth so bitter it was almost laughable, that the answer should have been no, that being near him was the most dangerous thing that could happen to those 2 children, not because he would hurt them, but because everyone who wanted to hurt him now had something to aim at that they hadn't had before. He was a man whose enemies had spent years hunting for a crack, and he had just discovered that the crack not only existed, it had 2 names, Haven and Willa, and they had been walking through this world, exposed, for 4 years without anyone protecting them. That thought chilled him in a way no enemy ever had, because he suddenly saw again in his memory the dark sedan pulling close to the curb that afternoon, and he understood that it hadn't been random, that someone had been watching, that the instinct that had kept him alive for so many years was screaming something he didn't want to hear, that someone had begun tracking that woman, and if that someone was who he thought it was, then discovering who those 2 children were would only be a matter of time. And when that day came, 2 little lives that had never harmed anyone would become the most valuable thing, and therefore the most dangerous thing, in his entire war. He thought of his father, of the man who had taught him with his fists that love was a weakness, and weakness had to be crushed. And for the first time he wondered whether that fear, handed down through all those years, had made him build a world his own children couldn't enter, and still be safe. He hated the thought that perhaps the only thing he could give them to protect them was his absence, that the best father a man like him could be was maybe one who knew how to stay away. But at the same time, something else rose inside him too, the thing that had first stirred when the little girl held out the red bracelet, something stubborn and starving and dead for far too long. It refused to accept that cold solution. It told him he had already lost 4 years he would never get back, and that if he walked away now, he would be no different from the woman who had stopped Maeve at the door all those years ago, just one more link in the machine that had stolen this very thing from him. And he sat there between the 2 men inside himself, the cold survivor telling him to disappear so they could live, and the father newly born in him that night begging him not to go, until near dawn he finally stood. And he knew that whichever road he chose, the price would be paid in blood. The only question left was whose blood it would be. Sloane didn't need anyone to tell her. She pieced it together herself, because fear, once it grows large enough, turns a person into a detective with a meticulousness that can become cruel. She had put people on her own fiancé, and when the reports of him visiting the apartment on the south side a second time, then a third, gathered together with the birth month of the 2 children she had quietly looked up, with the face of the smaller child she still remembered with painful clarity from that night at the club, with the way Kill had suddenly changed over the past few weeks, everything locked into a picture she wished she had never seen. She went to him in Lake Forest on a gray afternoon, and she didn't scream. She walked into his study with a frightening calm, placed the paper marked with the dates she had gathered herself on the desk in front of him, and said, "I know. Those 2 little girls are yours." Kill didn't deny it. He had never wasted effort lying when the truth was already on the table. And it was his confirming silence that did what no words could have done. It pulled all the air from her chest. She stood there, the woman who had been taught all her life that her worth lay in her ability to carry a family line forward. And she heard her own voice break as she said, "Do you know what I've traded away for this marriage? Do you know that last week I sat in a clinic and listened to someone tell me I may never be able to have a child? While you already had 2, with a woman who scrubbed floors, and you didn't even bother to know they existed." Then she laughed, a sound choked with tears, because the injustice of it was so enormous there was no other way to answer it. In that moment, she was no longer the cruel woman from the bar, but only a wounded human being standing before living proof that the thing she wanted most and couldn't reach had come easily to someone else and had even been forgotten. And Kill, looking at her, understood for the first time that her bitterness all this time had been woven from the same cloth as his coldness. Fear of being abandoned dressed up as strength. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Not the apology of a man who was guilty toward her for this, but the apology of someone seeing, for the first time, the wound beneath her armor, and that hurt her more than any argument would have. She picked up the paper and stood for a long time by the glass, looking out over the gray lake, and she knew exactly what she was holding in her hand. A piece of information she could sell to her father, so he could tear apart the alliance in the most profitable way for the Whitlock family. Or worse, a piece of information that, if it reached the ears of a man like Rory Keane, would turn 2 little girls into playing pieces in a bloody game. She thought about how sweet revenge would taste. The woman who had cost her the man she was supposed to marry. The man who had kept an enormous truth from her. Both of them could collapse with a single phone call from her. But then she thought of the smaller child's face at the bar that night, of the red bracelet the little girl had clutched so tightly while Sloane poured her rage over her and her mother, of the truth that if she did what she was considering, she wouldn't merely hurt Kill or that other woman. She would place 2 innocent lives in exactly the kind of danger that even someone as hardened as she was couldn't touch without revulsion. And she stood there, torn between a pain that demanded repayment and something smaller but more stubborn inside her, the part that still knew the difference between an enemy and a child. She left Lake Forest that afternoon without making any call, carrying in her purse a paper with the destructive force of a bomb, still undecided whether she would be the one to light the fuse or the one to defuse it. Rory Keane didn't need the truth about bloodlines in order to act. He only needed to know that this woman mattered to Voss, and the care Voss used to protect her only confirmed it. So one evening, just after Maeve had sent her 2 daughters over to Mrs. Kowalski's so she could go take a night cleaning shift at a small, independent office building that didn't care about background checks, a meager job she had desperately begged for after days of rejection, Keane's men were already waiting. This time, none of Kill's cars arrived in time to cut them off, as Keane's men had staged a brutal multi-car accident 2 blocks away, completely trapping Voss's tailing security in a gridlock of smoke and shattered glass. They took her cleanly and quietly in the empty parking lot, and the only thing that kept Maeve from collapsing in terror was the thought that her children were safe many blocks away, seeing nothing, knowing nothing, shielded from this moment. She clung to that thought the way Willa clung to the red bracelet. They brought her to an abandoned warehouse on the west side, and Keane was waiting for her there, polite in a way that turned the stomach. He poured her a glass of water she didn't touch, and said he didn't mean to hurt her. She was only a letter he needed to send. He wanted Voss to come here, alone, so the 2 men could talk about the future of the city. And Maeve, though she was frightened numb, still looked straight at him and said he had chosen the wrong person if he thought she was worth that much. But both she and he knew she was lying, because his phone had already rung, and Kill's voice on the other end had been enough to confirm everything. Kill came, alone as promised, and that was Keane's first and last mistake, because he thought a man coming to save a weakness would come in desperation, and therefore be easy to control. He didn't understand that the man who had just stepped into the warehouse was no longer someone with only one war to keep, but a father who, for the first time in his life, had something to protect. And nothing is more dangerous than a man like that when there is no road left behind him. Kill walked in with his hands empty, and his eyes already measuring every angle of the room, and in the minutes that followed, everything happened fast and clean. His people had been following from outside. A sound. The lights went out, bodies fell in the dark, and Maeve was pulled behind a concrete pillar by a familiar hand, hidden from view, told to close her eyes and not look. When the lights came back on, only Keen remained, disarmed, kneeling on the cold cement floor, and Kill stood before him with a gun in his hand and a lifetime of reasons to pull the trigger. This was the moment the old man inside him had lived for, the man who had taught the whole city fear by never allowing a threat to survive. And Maeve, though she had been told not to look, opened her eyes anyway. She didn't beg for Keen's life. She only said softly, just loud enough for Kill to hear, "Willa asked if you were safe, and you said yes. You want that to be true, don't you?" Those 3 words, "Were you safe?" echoed through him at the exact second his finger had settled on the trigger, and he saw again the little girl's dark eyes lifted to him in absolute trust. He understood that if he pulled the trigger now, he would forever be the man who couldn't answer that question honestly, that he would build his daughters a future on the same blood-soaked foundation his father had built his life on. And for the first time in his adult life, Killer Voss lowered the gun, not because of weakness, but because of a strength he had never known he possessed. He told Keen that he would live, but he would live to watch everything he had built be taken apart so legally, so completely, that he would wish Kill had chosen the bullet. And the way he said it, cold and certain, made it more terrifying than any gunshot. He turned to Maeve, and in the cold warehouse light, she saw a man who had just stood on the very edge of the person he used to be, and had pulled himself back, not because anyone forced him to, but because of a question asked by a 4-year-old child. And she stepped toward him, saying nothing, only placing one hand on the arm that held the gun and slowly lowering it all the way down. And for the first time since that night 5 years ago, those 2 wounded people stood facing each other with no armor left between them. What Maeve didn't know, what she only came to understand many days later, was that she had been saved so quickly, not only because of Kill's men, but because when Keen began asking around the city to confirm the value of his prey, one of the men he approached happened to have once worked for the Whitlock family, and that news reached Sloane on the very evening she was still carrying in her purse the paper with the destructive force of a bomb. In that moment, she had to choose, not between revenge and forgiveness in some abstract way, but between staying silent and letting everything unfold in a direction that would benefit her, or picking up the phone and calling Kill to tell him that Keen had moved and Maeve was in danger, and she chose to pick up the phone. She chose to be the one who defused the detonator instead of the one who lit the fuse, even though doing so meant using her own hand to extinguish the last chance she had to reclaim what she had lost. A few days later, she came to the apartment on the south side alone, with no escort, with no makeup worn like armor, and Maeve opened the door with her whole body tightened in caution, because this woman was the symbol of everything that had fallen on her life. But Sloane didn't step inside. She stood at the threshold and said she had come to apologize, and that she knew an apology wouldn't fix anything. Then her eyes fell to Willa, who was hiding behind her mother's leg, the child with the red bracelet whose knot had begun to loosen and fray almost to the point of breaking. Sloane slowly lowered herself to her knees, so she was level with the little girl, far enough away not to frighten her, and she asked in a gentle voice no one had ever heard from her before, whether she might look at the bracelet for a moment. And Willa, with the strange instinct of children who can read the heart before adults can, held out her wrist. Sloane, with fingers accustomed to diamonds and never to any kind of handwork, clumsily braided the loosened red thread back together and tied the knot tight again, and as she did, she bowed her head and whispered an apology that only the child could hear, an apology not meant for Maeve, not meant for anyone watching, but meant only for the small, innocent life she had poured her pain onto that night at the club. When she stood, her eyes were wet, and she told Maeve she was leaving the city, that she was calling off the wedding and facing her father, and building a life for herself that wasn't the keystone in anyone else's roof. She said she hoped, awkwardly and sincerely, that Maeve's daughters would grow up safe in a way neither she nor that man had ever been. Then she turned away and went down the shabby stairs in an expensive coat that looked painfully out of place in that building, and Maeve stood in the doorway watching her go. What Maeve felt wasn't the satisfaction she had once imagined she would feel if that woman ever had to pay for what she had done. It was something far more complicated, something close to compassion, because she realized that Sloane, too, was only a human being, taught by a cruel world that her worth lay in the things that could be taken from her, and that between 2 women who had seemed like enemies there was a common thread neither of them had chosen. Maeve gently tightened her hold on her daughter's hand, watched the woman's figure fade into the rain, and silently wished for her to find her own way. Killer Voss understood something most men in his world refused to understand until it was far too late, that he couldn't be Haven and Willa's father, and still be the man the whole city didn't dare speak of aloud. That those two roles absolutely excluded each other, because as long as he remained seated at the top of that empire, there would always be another Keen, another enemy, another strange car pulling close to the curb where his daughters walked home from school, and the protection he could give them through power would always be smaller than the danger that same power dragged to their door. He had lived long enough to know that men didn't leave this life by simply stepping out quietly. No one allowed a man who knew as much as he did to retire in peace. So he did the one thing no one ever thought a man like him would do. He contacted a federal prosecutor he knew couldn't be bought, one of the very few people in the city he had never been able to touch. And he sat down in a room with his lawyer and placed an offer on the table. He would turn over Rory Keane and his entire network. He would provide evidence of the way the Whitlock family's clean money had been shaking hands with the underworld for years. The alliance Desmond Whitlock had spent 3 generations laundering his name to hide. And in return, he wasn't asking to walk free, because he knew, and the FBI knew, that there was no version of this in which a man like him walked out of that room as an innocent man. He understood the price with perfect clarity. He would have to plead guilty to the things he had done. He would have to go to prison. He would lose many years of the life he had only just found a reason to live. But he also understood that this was the only form of protection he could give his 2 daughters that would truly last. A world where Keane was put on public trial, instead of being erased in a warehouse. A world where the machine that had once stopped their mother at the door was dismantled link by the law, rather than by another bullet. And most importantly, a world where his daughters wouldn't have to grow up knowing their father had bought their safety with blood. He told Maeve about that decision in the familiar cramped kitchen, and she neither rejoiced nor tried to stop him. She only listened to the man who had once believed strength meant never being accountable to anyone, now voluntarily walking into the place that would strip him of every piece of power he had. And she realized that this was the strongest thing she had ever seen him do, stronger even than the moment he lowered the gun in the warehouse, because this time there was no enemy kneeling in front of him, only the price to be paid, and his willingness to pay it. The months that followed moved according to the cold procedure of the law. Keane was prosecuted alongside a long list of crimes that finally had enough witnesses willing to step forward. The Whitlock financial empire was carved open across the newspapers. Desmond Whitlock went from a powerful man to an aging defendant, hiring one lawyer after another. And Killer Voss stood before the court and accepted his share of responsibility, without evasion, without shifting blame. And the sentence he received, though reduced because of his cooperation, was still real years behind bars. But before that door closed, he had finished one thing. He sat with his lawyer and arranged for everything he had, assets that had been cleaned through legal channels, to be placed into a trust in Haven and Willa's names. Not to buy off his conscience, but to make certain that even if he was gone for many years, this time, unlike the 4 years already lost, his daughters would never have to count loose change in a coffee tin, or hear their mother lying awake because of a notice tucked beneath a stack of mail. During the brief stretch of time before he had to surrender himself to begin serving his sentence, Maeve did something that only a few months earlier she couldn't have imagined. She let him come to the apartment in the afternoons, not as a crime boss, not as a threat, but as a man learning how to be a father in the little time he had. And those afternoons were awkward at first in a way that was almost painful to witness. He sat at the edge of the old chair, not knowing where to put his hands, speaking to the 2 little girls in the voice of a man no one had ever taught how to be gentle. And the children, for their part, watched this large, unfamiliar man, with the caution children always use before they decide whether to give someone their trust. Haven, true to her nature, was the one who broke the ice first, with a flurry of questions and little commands that he had to look at the picture she had drawn. But Willa kept her distance longer. The child watched him from behind her sister through many afternoons, her fingers still reaching for the red bracelet on her wrist whenever he came too close. Until one afternoon, when the room had gone quiet and Haven was busy on the floor with her colored markers, Willa suddenly stood up, crossed the stretch of floor between herself and the man, and without a word of warning, climbed into his lap, as naturally as if that were the place she had always belonged. She settled herself there, then lifted her dark eyes to his, and held out her wrist with the red thread bracelet, now firmly braided back together, as if she were sharing with him the most precious thing she owned. Killer Voss, the man the whole city had once not dared to name aloud, the man who had stood in rooms with death hanging over him and never blinked, sat perfectly still, hardly daring to move, and when he finally raised one arm and wrapped it around that small body, his hand trembled. Trembled the way a man's hand does when he has just been given something so fragile that he fears his own weight might break it. He said nothing, because no words were enough. He only lowered his head close to the child's hair and closed his eyes. And Willa, her head resting against the chest of the father she had never known was her father, called him by a short, sweet little name, the kind children invent for the people they've decided to love, and that name went deeper into him than every wound he had ever taken. Haven looked up from her markers and saw that her sister had already claimed an excellent seat, and immediately abandoned her drawing and ran over to demand her share, climbing up onto his other side with all her noise and certainty. And so the man who had once believed he had nothing to lose sat there with both small lives that carried his blood pressed against either side of his chest, one quiet and one loud, neither of them having the faintest idea that the arms holding them were the same arms an entire city had once feared. Maeve stood silently in the kitchen doorway watching the scene, and she didn't step forward, didn't say a word. She only lifted one hand to cover her mouth and let the tears fall in silence, because she was witnessing the very thing she had stopped daring to dream of for 4 years. Not wealth, not the kind of safety money could buy, but simply the moment her children were being seen and gathered into someone's arms by the very person who should have been there from the beginning, and she understood that no matter how many long years of waiting still lay ahead, no matter what price had been paid and what price still would be, this quiet moment, a child holding out a red bracelet and a trembling man receiving it, was something no power in the world could ever take back again. The years that followed didn't pass like a fairy tale, because real life rarely grants anyone a complete ending without first asking them to pay the price. Killoran Voss served out his sentence, one day at a time, with no shortcuts, and throughout those years Maeve didn't disappear from his life the way that Old Machine had once made her disappear. She brought the girls to visit him regularly, so Haven and Willa could grow up with the truth instead of an emptiness, so they would know their father was a man who had done many wrong things, but had finally chosen to stand up and take responsibility instead of running away. And that, all by itself, was a lesson she wanted her daughters to carry with them. That a person's worth doesn't lie in never having fallen, but in how they rise again, and how willing they are to pay for the harm they once caused. As for Maeve, she finally returned to the classroom and finished the nursing degree she had once had to leave behind at 22. She studied, worked, and raised her children all at once. And this time she no longer had to count every loose coin in a coffee tin, not because someone had handed her a miracle, but because she had been given the very thing she had always deserved from the beginning, a fair chance and the respect owed to the dignity she had never once lost, even in the darkest nights. And when he came home after paying his debt, they didn't rush into some perfect home. They began slowly, carefully, like two people who understood that lasting things need time to be built, and they built it, one day at a time, around 2 children who were older now, though Willa still wore on her wrist the red thread bracelet that had been rebraided by hands no one had expected. What this story wants to leave behind isn't a romantic picture of darkness, but something far simpler and far more true. That every person we pass without thinking, the server who clears our table, the one who mops the floor where we walk without even looking down, the quiet figure standing at the edge of our lives, is carrying a whole world of love, fear, and dignity, no smaller than our own. And the moment we stop long enough to truly see them can change not only their life, but ours as well. Kindness doesn't need power in order to be strong, and sometimes the question that saves a human being isn't a threat or a sum of money, but only a child looking up and asking whether it's safe here. If this story touched something in your heart, please take 1 second to press the like button, share it with someone you think needs to hear this today, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep listening together to many more meaningful stories every day. And we truly want to know how this story made you feel. Did it remind you of someone in your real life? Someone you may have accidentally forgotten to truly see? Please leave a comment and tell us, because we always read and always cherish every feeling that comes from deep inside your hearts. Thank you for staying with us until this very last moment. May everyone watching this video have abundant health, a joyful life, and may every passing day be peaceful and serene. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.